So let's look at what happens when you have the first sentences from a bunch of paragraphs all lined up with the guts of the paragraph missing. So here's the very first sentence of an essay. It almost goes without saying that lay critics of MGM's 1939 film The Wizard of Oz interpret Dorothy as a good girl. Now, it's the very first sentence of an essay, so you would say, well, what would the transitional element be? I'm starting from the beginning. There is no transition. But there is, because I'm saying it almost goes without saying that lay critics, right? I'm talking about how the movie has been received over the past, 70, 80 years, right? So I'm referring to lay critics, which are like, your mom and your dad. Lay critics are not professional critics. They are kind of the everyman who just makes his or her comment about the movie. So lay critics of 1939's film always say that Dorothy is a good girl. Well, that's now going to be the topic of what I talk about. Okay? So this paragraph, the introduction, goes on and on and on and talks about how Dorothy's a good girl. She doesn't want her dog to get in trouble. She doesn't want to, hurt the Tin Man or the Wicked Witch of the West or the East, or she's just a good girl. Blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on and on. Until I come to my thesis, which is the one time where we put something all in bold. I want you to put your entire thesis sentence in bold. It will be at the end of your introductory paragraph. So these two are the same paragraph right here. Okay? So I can just say paragraph 1. I start my paragraph with a transition from common culture, and I move into a statement that I want to focus on. Dorothy's a good girl. And I then make my claim that maybe the movie focuses on her being such a good girl all the time to kind of distract us from Dorothy is arguably bad. You can see that right there. Yes? Okay, that's my thesis. Dorothy's a bad girl. So in paragraph 2, I say to begin, okay? And this is kind of a transition because I'm starting the argument of the paper. Let us look at the Wicked Witch of the West's death in more detail. Okay, well, that's going to be the topic of this paragraph, so I can put it in bold. Since it serves as the most exacerbated instance of this tension between Dorothy's goodness and badness. Well, that's a recap of what I talked about in the introduction. Sentence 1 of the introduction was good. Thesis was bad, right? And you can see, the stuff I haven't highlighted is kind of the connection between these two. It's a good instance. It's a good example. Wicked Witch of the West's death is an example of what I'm talking about when I say that Dorothy is both good and bad. So we then go to the third paragraph. And we see such characterization comes to light early on in the film. Well, there must have been something talked about in paragraph 2 that was some kind of characterization. So I'm recapping that. And what am I going to talk about now? Oh, I'm going to talk about early on in the film. Okay, that's going to be the topic of this paragraph. Because remember, the Wicked Witch of the West dies late in the film. So why am I doing this out of order? Well, because the Wicked Witch of the West's death is, the main part of the whole film, right? So start with like the most heavy-hitting instance of Dorothy's goodness being in question. Then back up to earlier in the film where we can see the same thing going on, but in a less obvious fashion. Does that make sense? Paragraph 4. By the time the first actual death occurs in the film, the Wicked Witch of the East being killed by Dorothy's house falling on her, it is not surprising then that Dorothy is held accountable. All right. So again, we've got recap here, right? Because we've got death again. Another witch, is surprisingly murdered or dead or killed or accidentally done away with when Dorothy just happens to be nearby. So we've got death occur. That's kind of a recap again of what we've been talking about. And now I'm really hitting it home. This is not an accident. This is accountability, right? I'm really making the point that in the first one, okay, there was just a tension between Dorothy's good and badness. And then in the third paragraph, I elaborate on that at the beginning of the film. But again, I'm not really blaming Dorothy. I'm just saying, this is an interesting possibility. By the time I get to paragraph 4, I'm willing to actually hold her accountable. Okay? So there's development going on here. By the time I get to paragraph 5, the critical import of this homophone, well, clearly I must have been talking about a homophone in the last paragraph, so that must be a connection to the last paragraph, was predicted earlier in the film when Dorothy had her fortune read in Professor Marvel's caravan. Well, what is this paragraph going to be about? Dorothy being in Professor Marvel's caravan. Again, I've done the same switch with paragraphs 4 and 5. They're out of chronological order. Professor Marvel's caravan happens before the Wicked Witch of the East is killed. But again, I set it up in a way that makes the argument easy to read, not just first, second, third, fourth, in accordance with the film. By the time I get to paragraph 6, I'm arguing it appears then that the Wizard of Oz wants to frame Dorothy as an emissary of death. Whoa, okay. Notice how she's gone from just being a bad girl to actually being a murderer, right? This is development. I'm now going to write about how I think Dorothy is a murderer. And when I say it appears then that the Wizard of Oz wants to frame Dorothy, well, this then suggests kind of a recap of all the paragraphs that I've been talking about up until this point. I'm going through this very quickly, and I understand it's quite hard to wrap your mind around, but you can watch this video again, you can stop it, you can read these paragraphs over step by step, but I hope you can see that every paragraph is referring back to some previous piece of writing, as well as introducing what that paragraph is going to be about. And if you notice, all of these basically are, like when you take these sentences all together, they're like a summary or a synopsis or an abstract of the whole paper. I mean, this is a 5-page paper. It begins with a very innocent observation. Dorothy might not be as good as she appears to be. It walks through some examples of how she's not good. I'm using examples of death over and over and over again, but I don't really focus on the death element. I just focus on something bad happened, Dorothy was around when this bad thing happened. And then I slowly reorient that focus from bad, which is kind of an innocent, childish problem, to murder, which is quite, a bolder claim to make. Your first sentences of every paragraph should have a similar attention to where you've been and where you're going. If you summarize for your reader what you finished explaining, and you make a logical connection from that summary to what you now want to talk about in the new paragraph, the level of clarity in your paper is going to skyrocket. So even if the guts of the paragraph are confusing, your reader will always be able to go back and anchor themselves based on your first sentence of that paragraph. Good luck, and I look forward to seeing your highlighting and your bolding in the papers you hand in.